I'm Destina Connor. I'm one of the organizers of the meetup, and for over a decade I've been one half of a tiny indie game dev studio called T-Powered Games, where I am a game designer. I focus on holistic game design and emergent properties and feelings of game systems, especially as they relate to narrative. This is Emily Short, a longtime author of interactive fiction, as well as narrative wearer of various hats in wider game spaces, including many contributions within indie AAA studios and beyond. She's been a contributor to the community, original organizer of this very meetup, frequently a voice for being aware of the barriers to enjoying interactive fiction and the hazy kind of boundaries around the works themselves and access to a sense of community around them. Do you want to add anything to that? Is that okay?
No, that's fine.
That's good. Yeah, okay, cool. We've been friends for years. I thought it might be fun to kind of just have as informal a chat as we can in front of such a large audience. I jokingly, when I proposed this to Emily, I jokingly called it a chat about interactive fiction with as little utility as possible. It was like, there is a version of this where people come and they're like, okay, well, how do I get into the industry? How do I get a job? What is the correct, platform I should be, engine I should be using, and all this stuff. And those are valuable questions with their own answers, and they're also things that we answer a lot and don't really get at the heart of why I think it's interesting to engage with interactive fiction and what you can do with it and what I personally get out of it. So we spoke a bit in advance. I have some question-y prompts. We're going to kind of meander around them, and at some point we will make time for answering audience questions, hopefully having hit something interesting or inspiring along the way. So yeah, that's it.
That's the plan.
Yeah, okay, excellent. So our first question, which could easily take the entire time up. What is interactive fiction?
Right, okay, so I did have a warning of this question. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing to put boundaries around, and people who come to it without sort of additional context tend to think, well, it just means any kind of story-shaped thing that you can somehow interact with. But where the sort of entry point that I had to interactive fiction was parser-based text games from the 1980s, things that you're playing on a Commodore or something fairly simple, and you're reading on a screen, perhaps from Zork, perhaps from a different Infocom game, perhaps in the UK, and a sort of different set of text adventures, but you're reading descriptions of the location that you're in, you're typing instructions about where you want to go and what you want to do, you're getting text back, and you're sort of building this entire imaginary world around the text that you're reading, and you're thinking about what is possible for me to do, and I'm going to tell the system back what I want to do, and then it's going to say, I didn't understand what you just typed, then you're going to have a frustrating interaction with it over and over again until you get to accept what you just typed, and then it will tell you why what you just typed was the wrong thing to do, and you're now dead. Repeat for quite a while. I loved these games. I really deeply loved them, and part of the reason for that was this sort of sense of being able, as a child, I was a kid in the 80s, believe it or not. I feel like I'm about Methuselah in this crowd. But as a kid, a lot of the world is mysterious and weird and doesn't make a lot of sense, and what interactive fiction offered, I felt, was the ability to enter a space in which there was some purpose to everything that was there. And I could interact with it, and I was finding out what these things were for. I was finding out what the puzzles were about, and so on. So that was really kind of the entry point for me. And that was a sort of genre that at the time was called text adventures, started to be called interactive fiction in later years.
Is it already dead?
Yes.
We're
All right.
already having technical difficulties. Do you want to borrow my
Okay. No, it's I will try projecting. Can people hear? Is that okay? Cool. Okay. It's actually more of an informal chat if I am not holding a mic to my face, so we'll see how this goes. So that was the entry point for me, but the genre of interactive fiction has kind of accrued variants and adherents and communities around it, often doing very different things, and that has come to include choose your own adventure books. It's come to include Twine and hypertext fiction type games. It's come to include mobile games that are sort of focused on relationships or a bit like visual novels. And so now it's kind of a broadly shaped, fuzzy-edged game genre that people will have fights about. And I would say the core of it still remains this idea of there might be some illustrations, there might be some visuals, but there is text on the screen. Like, we're fundamentally interacting with something that is textual, as opposed to it's purely a visual novel or it's purely a sort of more conventional type of game. And then also that you are making some decisions that are in some way, and the huge air quotes around this, driving the story forward or affecting where it's going. And that's the sort of like what I would consider to be the sort of core features. And then around that are many, many sort of peripheral things. And what I just said, slightly horrifyingly, could mean that like ChatGPT is interactive fiction, which I would not agree with. So it gets messy. But I will stop there because that was a long ramble.
No, that's good. And it also...
Sorry.
It's okay.
I think this will.
So it also brings to mind, Aaron actually had to answer a similar question when he was deciding what to put in the book, right? Mm-hmm. What counted to go into the history of these like 50 years of text games. And his criteria, when he wasn't answering exactly the same question, but it was similar, right? He decided, and he similarly had like fuzzy boundaries around it and everything, but he decided if a script was more meaningful to show than a screenshot, right?
Yeah.
And that's interesting, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting because it commits to this idea of like there is something linear that is the trace that we're experiencing that's kind of key to what the experience is. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have always found it really kind of weird to engage with this definition of interactive fiction and figure out where, say, like my personal place is, and this is going to bleed in a little bit to the next question, but because when I was a child of the 80s, I grew up on JRPGs, which surprises nobody who knows me, but like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest and stuff, like that captured my imagination, and like I'm not leaping to be like, oh, they should be included in the interactive fiction canon. They, like, if you look at it, they have very clear lineages because, like, text adventures spawn CRPGs in a certain way. Those crossed over to Japan, JRPGs are born. But I often find that there's this weird thing that happens where, depending on what space you're in and what definition you're using for games or interactive fiction, the thing that you're looking at looks maybe more like a tech toy, or it looks like literature, or like some of these definitions make it look more like it's art and should be engaged with in a certain way, and some of them are like somebody will. I mean, like I work in this is my career, and a very close friend the other day was over our house and was like, yeah, but basically the point of games is fun though.
Right.
And I was there like, get out.
Yes, we need to talk.
But like at the same time, like you can see where people take the word games and like its lineage and come from like has this adjacency to toys and like what fun means there, and those also inform the creation of interactive narrative games, which also are adjacent to interactive fiction. And so it's this messy soup of things and what you call it and how you define it.
I mean, a lot of the time, some of this is driven by the genre and the terminology being attracted to wherever there are resources that people want to lay claim to. So if there are resources for grants for art projects, then, oh my god, it's an art project, check it out. And if there are resources to sell things that are games or resources to sell toys, then there's, but it's not, it's like, that frames it as purely commercial, which is not even what I mean. It's more kind of like, it's so sort of hard to pin down that people tend to kind of reframe it a lot.
Yeah, like the more I ask this question myself and come up with different answers, it's like there are all sorts of answers which are themselves correct or more or less correct, right? And the question that I always follow up to myself or to others is, why are you asking? Like, why are you asking and answering this?
Yeah.
And like, what does that definition do?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, often it's also gatekeeping around the resources. Again, right? Like, you know, people getting annoyed about things being counting as games because they want certain money to be available or placement on Steam or whatever it is. Yeah.
And I remember really casually, even when we were like organizing this meetup together, we were like, okay, well, what counts as a thing that we can include in the meetup?
Right.
Like, what is IF adjacent?
I mean, as you may recall, I completely cheated ultimately, and I was like, if I want us to talk about it, we're going to do that, because it was just easier ultimately. Like, if we find it interesting,
yeah,
then,
but it seemed totally appropriate, and I think people were always on board with that.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's
well,
for us
subset were on board.
Yeah. Well, and I think there was no one thing that we could be like, everybody would be on board with this.
Yeah.
Like, somebody will.
Yeah.
Some subset of people will, and that makes it worthwhile. Right.
But I mean, I think the cool thing about that, though, is that you create a space where people can come in from, you know, I'm a student in a games program, or I am a person who played these games in the 80s and I want to commune with my retro kin, or, you know, I really want to do this art project, and they can sort of find points of commonality, they can share tech, they can share kind of creation experiences, and sometimes you will have the focus of a particular talk or a particular evening be like, we're really going to do a you know, very technical deep dive, and sometimes you're going to have things that are much more like, you know, let's play through some things and talk about them. So you've got a range of ways to engage, but they kind of allow people to make contact in multiple spots, which I think is really critical and really sort of important to what IF is.
Yes, absolutely. I think often when I'm looking at definitions of interactive fiction, I'm trying to figure out what things I can connect. How can that act as a bridge? Like, I remember when I was like pitching to you a talk about JRPGs and interactive narrative in JRPGs, and I'm like, does this even count? Like, I love these things, and I think about them in this way, and there's all these adjacencies.
Yeah, and is it going to speak to us and to our concerns? And if yes, then it's worth having that conversation.
Yeah. No, and that was fantastic. So, sorry, move on.
It's okay. Yeah, go
ahead. I have no idea at the time. I have no clock in view or anything.
Quarter past 6.
Cool. Just keep shouting that at me every like. So, what's your connection to interactive fiction? You've already started answering this, and we don't need like your full history.
The whole life story. We could be here for a while. Yeah. No, I mean, so really that sort of 80s experience was the core of it, and then I spent a lot of time as a teenager really wanting to write my own interactive fiction and doing all sorts of weird things like writing terrible basic programs, or writing interactive fiction room descriptions on paper cards that I could draw out of a box so I could like run the computer-based game for my friends as a like live event, because somehow like just doing D&D would like, that wasn't cool. It needed to be a fake text adventure. So I mean, that was like, it really kind of always spoke to me a lot, and I think part of the reason was some of the cross-disciplinary aspects that we've actually already identified of, I really liked that it was a writing exercise, a creative exercise, a context where I could be using those skills in that part of my brain, and at the same time a technical and design exercise around, I want to create something where I am thinking about this material systemically, and that's that's like this gets into a sort of more personal thing. I wouldn't want to say like all interactive fiction needs to be doing this, but to me, part of what the appeal is that it is an art form, maybe the only art form. Well, I don't want to. No, I will stop that sentence right there. I'm going to trouble there. No, it's okay. It is an art form in which, let me just do that. We can represent systems and how things work systemically and still have that representation be fundamentally expressive and communicative and storytelling. And so it's that sort of curious juxtaposition. And at one end of the spectrum, you have things like Caves of Cud and Dwarf Fortress, where like the system is really, really at the forefront of the experience, and you're seeing something that but nonetheless, if you play Caves of Cud, what you get out of that is like, there's a story, there's a setting here, it's very, like, it may change from time to time, but something is coming out of this which is really expressing a particular, kind of world, and there's an artistic surface to it. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are things that are interactive fiction that are much less systemsy and are much more sort of text forward, but you still need to be thinking about how is the player engaging with this, how is the system responding to what the player is doing, and what am I expressing by doing that? What am I saying about kind of how this system as a whole works, right? So I'm representing, like, whether that's I'm representing relationships systemically, which is something that I really find interesting, or I'm representing physics systemically. It's like sort of it's like a sculptural form in a way, as well as just a textual form.
Yeah, I like, so to answer personally and then kind of like I interacted with, like, aside from tales of the fact that like my bedroom as a baby was wallpapered with hand-drawn maps of Zork, which I'm told was a thing. But like my mom was into it. But I mostly engaged peripherally. Like I didn't know about parser games. I didn't know about interactive fiction. I engaged with JRPGs and tabletop role-playing, which are obviously these kind of like very closely adjacent. But from the beginning of engaging with tabletop role-playing, I was always, like, I wasn't just playing D&D, I was like inventing my own system. I was engaging with it in that way that you're talking about, engaging with these other things. And then in like, as like games modernized, including the games that I liked, I was interested in narrative games, but not necessarily cinematically narrative. Like there's a certain version of narrative games which has just adopted the narrative form of cinema. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not like a bad thing.
Right.
But that's not what like I always engaged with, and it would never seemed apparent to me that was like an evolution, like a hierarchically better way to do things and cut out other ways of doing things. And I found that the interactive fiction label spoke to other ways of engaging with narrative, like you were talking about, the kind of systemic narrative. And I also find in my contracts, in my daily work still, I end up either with studios or on my own accidentally making visual novels or interactive fiction when that wasn't the intention. Like, just because narrative is at the heart of what we're doing, and like then we're doing stuff systemically, and it's not like we set out to do that, but then it's just like, okay, but this is the point, and the shortest distance between us and making the thing we actually care about is interactive fiction. That speaks to like its accessibility as an art form. No, I mean, a very important thing about interactive fiction is you do not need good reflexes to play it, which like if that were necessary, I would be out of luck. So okay, so like that's...
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you.
No, that was the end of my point. I'm just like trying to see if there's anything else I wanted to say in that space, but it actually kind of segues nicely to like these all kind of blur together, I guess. I was gonna give you a chance to say like favorite memories or touchstones or works, and like maybe you can be specific or as specific as you want.
So I was going to take the touchstone thing extremely literally, which was I had a plastic glow-in-the-dark Wishbringer as a child, which was this feeling that came with the Infocom game, and it represented this magic stone in the game, but that's a sort of crossover between, again, like this invented world that I can explore and come to understand, and then like the package comes with these, like this cool map and these physical objects, and games are hardly ever sold like that anymore, which, like, there are very valid reasons why that's the case, but it is a little bit sad. So a lot of my sort of early memories around playing these games also entailed sort of like poring over these wonderfully mysterious physical objects, and then sort of like the storytelling of the physical object also kind of tied into what the gameplay experience was as well.
I'm going to go in a different direction, which is, like, this is not a work of interactive fiction, but very much about interactive fiction. But very few things have influenced my ideas of game design as much as an online essay by Porpentine called Creation Under Capitalism in the Time Revolution, which you can still find, like, in a Wayback Machine, I think. And it really spoke to me about, like, changed the way I see games as an art and approach them, the ideas of challenge and friction and language around that, the way we talk about games versus the way we actually use them and the role they play in our life, and how sometimes the stories we tell about that don't mesh up with the reality, and kind of just poking at that. Not that that's like we do that everywhere in our lives, but also being like, hey, but it's a thing though. Just talking in this context, in the context of nominally like overturning what engine you should be using to make interactive fiction, but using that as this, like, thinking about avenues of change, personal change, social change, just in the context of wider social systems, as well as, like, being very intimately tied to the very narrow local to interactive fiction games and those examples. And like that was very kind of personal and stuck with me. That's I don't know anything else. So this isn't an easy topic to talk about, but I wanted to, like, I think it's easy to highlight the stuff we love, like fond memories and all of this stuff. And, like, we've been here long enough that we've witnessed our share of ugliness and messiness. And I always roll my eyes a little bit when I listen to a talk that's just like, let's all just focus on the positive, everything's good, right? And so without asking you to kind of like bare your personal soul, or
in front of a larger audience than expected.
In front of a larger audience than expected, and that we're recording and going to put on the internet.
Cool. All right, let's go.
Excellent. Like, what ugliness and messiness have we witnessed collectively in the hobby, the community, the industry, that we can share in a way that is
I mean, a lot of things that are not specific to interactive fiction, but I think are inevitable to, there's sort of patterns that I see in many communities, sort of arising in different ways. So you have things where there's a lot of gatekeeping, a lot of concern for resource, and resource doesn't, so when we were talking earlier about sort of, people will argue over these definitions of interactive fiction, like, people will really argue, like, they will get mean sometimes about what counts or does not count as truly interactive fiction, what deserves to be considered in this competition or not, like, and this should, we're going to vote these things ones because we don't think they deserve to be called interactive fiction. And you think, this is such a big fight over such a little thing. There's no, like, often these competitions, there's no or almost no, like, financial incentive. It's not going to lead to any sort of big lifetime changing reward or anything like that, but people get really intense about sort of drawing what are the boundaries of what we're doing and who gets to participate and who gets to be acknowledged, and the social status aspect of it, as well as kind of whatever material rewards might be associated with it. So that's one, is just this sort of like intensity that can arise around that. And the sort of converse of that, which is sometimes people experiencing things from the outside as exclusive or keeping them from access to resources when what they're actually looking at or poking at is just a friend group, or at least that's how the people on the inside perceive it. So one of the sort of flip sides of that is, you know, I'm part of a group of people who have been writing interactive fiction, as we called it, since the late 90s. I know some of those people very well. I am married to one of them. The fact that we like sometimes spend time together, like there have been times in the past where people who are not invited into those moments would be like, oh, this is so unfair. You people have access to each other. You're doing things which, like, you know, if only we could be part of that, then we too could have access to whatever magical, etc. It's like, no, we were just like, we just went out to dinner. It was a group of friends. That's it. There's not a thing. There's sort of a number of different sort of things that spin out from that. People having really strong reactions to the content of art and being positively moved, but also sometimes really negatively moved. I have gotten my share of angry mail, sometimes quite hateful mail about things that I wrote in games, and sometimes I could kind of see why it upset somebody, and sometimes I really could not understand what that was about, or why they wanted to write to me that they thought that my character deserved to be assaulted, or, you know, all sorts of weird things. So there are all of these different sorts of aspects, but I don't think any of that is unique to what interactive fiction is, and instead what it's about is kind of how human communities form and work, and the way that, like, especially when people are really invested in an art form, and when they, like, it's almost kind of when there's a potential for connection and communication that's that strong, like you can feel really quite intensely about an interactive experience that you're having, because it kind of can pull you in this way. It can feel really personal. And I think that, like, that's one of its strengths, but it also can mean that people can be really upset by the experience they have. They can have a really strong reaction to it that could be negative. They might project some of those feelings onto the author. And then all of the other sort of, you know, sort of just human, like, status group formation dynamics, and, like, it's difficult to kind of manage all of that, especially, and I feel like I'm going to keep pulling the conversation back to systems thinking versus sort of fiction thinking, but when the sort of example that I was talking about a moment ago of, you know, we have a group of people that are perceived from the outside to be exclusionary holders of some sort of special knowledge or power or access, but from the inside is just like, this is just a group of people that I've known for a number of years that I want to spend time with. Part of what's going on there is kind of a disparity between, I mean, the thing is, I don't want to frame it as like that's the critique is actually fully invalid. Like, I get where that's coming from. In fact, it's very difficult when you're on the other side of it to be like, what were you supposed to do? Like, we're supposed to not see each other, we're supposed to invite everybody to, you know, this basically private event. Like, how's that supposed to work? But I think part of what's going on there is sort of this tension between people understanding the systemic dynamic and trying to analyze the systemic dynamic, and people focused on the personal dynamic, and that kind of plays out in weird ways in life in general, but in this context in particular.
I'm going to show some of my leanings and maybe upset some people in the process, hopefully not, and add to that, like,
yeah,
all of that completely true, and capitalism, we were talking about fights for resources earlier. Like, it came up a couple times, like exclusion from resources and whatever, and I was part of a friend group in high school, and I remember we were like, oh, we're the uncool kids, and then speaking to some of the people who were not in our friend group afterwards, and they were like, no, you were the cool kids. So we were like, we weren't, no, but we were out and you were in, and they were like, no, you were, and so, like, multiply that across the entire world, and, like, you get human communities, right? But I also, like, there's what are the stakes? Right? Like, when it's friend groups and private events, and that's, like, this isn't even me saying, like, oh, those friend groups should be open up to everybody or anything. Yeah. It's just that like when people feel like, rightly or wrongly, and I suspect it's at least as much one as the other at various times, that their entrance, that their ability to make their way, whether it's make their dreams come true or pay the bills or anything, get access to scarce resources, whether those resources are feedback testers, help, community, connection, like, and that's not
feeling seen, feeling understood,
feeling seen and understood, and that gets squeezed in the broader social systems we find ourselves in. And so, because this ends up being different things to different people with those strong feelings, you just have, it just creates tragedy after tragedy, right? In so many ways. And there are, like, that's not to say people can't comport themselves better and can't, like, have more perspective and empathy and all of those things. And also we can end up in situations where there's going to be a loser here and it's going to kind of suck. And that, like, that's mostly what I'm getting at in terms of, like, an ugliness of, if I see an ugliness in this, it's that, like, unless we find better ways to change the stakes, ways to make these resources less scarce or less high stakes for people, then, like, we can organize better. We can always organize better. But there's also the possibility that there's an edge to that efficiency.
And as individuals, or as in any case, like, only so much any of us
can do, and, like, just both in terms of what we have access to and what we can be expected to do.
No, I agree.
Like, and as organizers, you and I both know that intimately.
Well, I mean, how much,
like, we do everything we can and then
creating
some.
Space,
Okay. Let's move on from that. So let's talk about tools for interactive fiction, and you have vastly more experience in this than I do, like, involved in, how much are you involved in Inform? Like, I know you're a tester.
I had a lot of influence on Inform historically. So Inform is a freeware language. It's now open source. It wasn't for many years, but it now is. For creating parser-based text adventures, and also you can do other things with it if you want to, but that was sort of its original purpose. And I was very heavily involved in kind of the language design. I was not actually writing the code, but I was heavily involved in sort of feedback on the language design and creation of it and the documentation of it in sort of 2003 to 2006, and then it's sort of released to the broader public. That was Graham Nelson's work. He is now my husband, so that was, like, clearly an important project in my life. I don't, these days, do very much direct work with it. For that matter, like, he is not sort of constantly working on it himself. We're both quite busy. But I have done some work on specifically a dialogue modeling system for that. So that's kind of expanding the classic functionality of a parser-based game is, you've got all of these physical objects that you can carry around and locked things and keys and lights and etc. And so most of the sort of languages developed for parser systems tend to really focus on that, and they spend more or less effort, like, carefully modeling all of those things. And that was part of the original draw to me, actually. It was like, I'm going to make this, like, intricately, I mean, we get back to my, like, systems fetish again. I can tell what impression I'm going to be leaving with people, but like, I was really interested in, like, how do you write the rules for how ropes behave and how fire behaves? It's tricky, right? Like, it moves between things and it destroys them, but not immediately. And, like, how do you, like, understand that computationally? How do you convey it in text? Like, does every single object have to be parentheses on fire? Anyway, so like there's all sorts of cool stuff, right, that you can do, but ultimately the games that you can write with that are only expressing one particular sort of corner of the human experience. And if you are also, as I am, really, really interested in people and how people interact and why they interact the way they do and how they talk to each other and how they misunderstand each other, then you also want to perhaps systematically model dialogue. And so I will not, there is, the open source version of Inform, I think, has the branch available already with the dialogue content implemented in it. So if people are curious, they can see it, but it's not like in a kind of official release stage yet. And I don't want to say a date associated with that, because then Graham will be sad when I go home and tell him that I did that. So, so I'm not going to do that, but like that exists, that's a thing. And what I was trying to do with that was make it a little bit easier for people who are interested in like either just modeling conversational flow in a parser-based text adventure, or like copying, like making a game that's really like predominantly about that, like whether, you know, they want to do that, or like doing something where they're just sort of moments when you can ask a character about an object and then kind of move on with the rest of your locks and keys based game. I wanted to make all of those things a bit easier and a bit sort of more naturally expressed in Inform. So like I worked with Graham on designing that module, and that's really kind of the most recent thing that I've done that was like tools work in the IF zone. So.
And I was just going to jump in and say, like, in the time-honored tradition of interactive fiction, of course, Flo and I also care quite a lot about modeling dialogue and completely disagree with the way you model it. So we went to different. I'm speaking tongue-in-cheek. I actually haven't tried your module yet, though I should. But
there's
so
not
many,
just one way to do it.
well, no, but like I mean, this is like this is at like the core kind of like there isn't any one catch-all tool.
Yeah.
Like there's obviously different forms of IF, and there are different kind of dominant tools.
Yeah.
Like we can name drop Twine, and Inform, like
Cats, Hugo,
Cats, yeah, exactly. But I've kind of, it's always struck me as both great and terrible. Like the scattershot of tools. Great in that you can, like, there's so many different choices and forms, and as a designer, I find it fascinating to see what what an engine, I always think of it as, what game does the engine want to make?
Yes. Yeah.
Like, that's a fascinating experience.
There's often a huge amount of founder effect there, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is the first game it was used to make? And that is kind of what it's adapted to,
Yeah, and, like, as a designer, that fascinates me. Like, I mean, I just love picking up a new engine and just being like, okay, one small project to figure out what the heck I'm doing.
Right. Yeah.
And then, like, what does this want me to make?
Yeah.
And then at some point you go off the rails and break it completely, and you're making some Hydra mess, which it was never intended to make. But then at the same time, like, the more scattered it is, if you move away from like dominant tools, it's hard to find support for them. It's hard to like.
Yeah. I mean, periodically people will make new tools that are trying to express kind of new paradigms for interaction, like texture, where you're dragging words across the screen to drop onto other words, which is like, it's a curious way of interacting, but it's kind of cool. So there are sort of like different experiments in those kinds of things.
And at the same time,
expensive.
And I can't speak to how large and constantly active this segment of the community that's kind of always supporting tools and it is, but like, it's still there.
Oh yeah.
I mean, like I was on the forums earlier
earlier
today, and there's
there are
recent
new
posts.
and there are new tools. Like dialogue is a relatively new parser tool. So
yeah, exactly. So like, it's just because these things, and I mean, which is its own archaeology project in a sense, in that many of these things that are being supported have their roots in the 50 years of text games, right? And you can see where that comes from, but yeah, it's kind of interesting and cool that support is still there and people still care so much about them.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this isn't like the ugliness and messiness, but like what realities of interactive fiction as a communal space, as a medium or a genre, would you want to share with people? Like I'll like give that a little bit of context. I think there's a world of difference between the imagined idea of being a writer and living it, or being a game designer and living
Right.
it. And like, so can we, with this platform, do a little bit to like piece and bridge that understanding for, or even just complicate the idea
Right.
of working with or engaging with interactive fiction?
Right. Okay, that question has ended up even bigger than I initially thought it was. But yeah, I mean, okay, so I think on the community side, I would say it's actually kind of the easiest piece for me to answer first. The thing that kind of pulled me into the IF community myself, as opposed to just being a person who was obsessed with writing these things like but off in a corner, was the kind of the depth and the vibrancy and the variety of feedback that you can get on your work. And the community, I mean, even just saying the community is totally a misnomer. Like, there are multiple different groups, but there are people who will engage with a piece of IF on many different levels and give reviews that will, like, you'll get from across the community reviews that will touch on, like, how well is this coded, how polished is the user experience, how good is the writing, and, like, not just like, oh, there aren't grammatical errors in the sentences, but like, let me dig into kind of thematically where I think this is going. Do I think it works or doesn't work? Do I like the characters? Where are they coming from? What are their sort of like, back, like what influences can I see in play here? How is this working within this genre? So like really fairly intensive, thoughtful critique that also spans into kind of the technical realm and addressing like, oh, this is experimentally, like it's formally experimental, and here's what it's doing in terms of its formal affordances, and let's really dig into that and talk about whether it works or it doesn't work, or what are the sort of things that led to you doing this in the first place. And that conversation was what I really wanted to be part of. And so, like that, the sort of communities have shifted, but there still is a lot of that energy out there. And it is a really exciting and really different place. If your primary experience of writing games and putting them out there is putting stuff out on itch or, God help you, on Steam, like, it is a completely different experience from that, because you are not dealing primarily with people who are seeing your work as a consumer product where they can say like, oh, this sucks, I played it for 49 hours but it wasn't good enough for the following reasons. And instead, like, I mean, you do get negative feedback, right? Like that's included in the package. But there can be a lot more sort of just like deep engagement with, what do I think this person was trying to do? Why does it work or not? And that can be very helpful from a craft perspective. A lot of what I learned as a narrative designer comes out of engaging with that community and getting that quality of feedback. It was like being in a really good grad level workshop for a long time. And then also just, kind of willingness to engage thematically. Like, if I have something that I really want to talk about in this piece of art, like, it's also a community that will often take that seriously and engage with it. And like, not everybody necessarily will get it or will like it, but some people may, and some people may, sort of have something to say about that. So that's the kind of community pitch, I guess. I'll stop there for a second.
No, yeah, like, so I was going to speak to just the experience, the very sometimes personal and raw experience of putting interactive fiction out there, partially because it's distanced from that consumer level.
Yeah.
I was giving a talk at a university about very personal interactive fiction, not personal to me at the time, but and one of the students asked me after the talk, like, is it scary sharing part of yourself in work, like those that I had shared? And I was like, it's scary, and rightly so, like, and it can hurt.
Yeah.
Right? like not just kind of imagine scary, but
Yeah.
some of that negative feedback
Yeah.
hurts,
Yeah.
even when it helps,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. But what I wanted to add afterwards was like just my very kind of personal why I do it anyways,
Yeah.
which was like it's always scary, but it's an opportunity to express yourself, and in expressing change yourself and or others. It's exhilarating
Yeah.
to like imagine something and then think I could make that happen.
Right.
I want to make that happen, and here's how I'm gonna do that.
Yeah.
And also, like in the case of like really kind of deep and personal stuff, like it might be scary, but sometimes the alternative, leaving something unexplored or unexpressed or unsaid, is just kind of unimaginable, or at the very least less tolerable.
Yeah.
And I experience it sometimes, and this is just me personally, like a hunger at times where
Yeah.
I look at it, I'm like, oh, why am I still doing this? And then I look at something and I'm just like, nope, I need to make that.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that's-
No, I get
that
it.
is
Yeah. I mean,
something.
sometimes. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to
Nope,
cut you off.
no, that was it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like, I wouldn't even say, like, I feel this necessarily, like, need to express something. I think it's, I mean, like, that's certainly, like, that comes into it sometimes, but I think for my own process, often I am, like, for the process of creating the work is a process to find out what I think, refine what I think, hold myself accountable, make sure that what I'm doing and saying is like actually what I really think, because there's nothing like, you know, you could have sort of some high level ideas about like, oh, this is what I think or feel about sort of how well people listen to each other, or this is a story that I want to tell about, you know, people of different generations talking across purposes, or whatever it is, right? Different stories. But there's something about the formal affordances of an interactive fiction game, especially if you share my inclinations towards systematizing everything, where it, like, the machine then is forcing you to write to a whole series of different prompts. Okay, like what happens in this case, this case, this case. We're going to step through this entire world state space, and you're going to have to think honestly about every single one of these. And it forces you to try and comprehend those things in a way that like checks for errors. And that's not to say like I always get everything right, obviously, but I find it really a powerful experience to do, and I find that it actually is refining my thought to something that I wouldn't, like, I'm not just kind of expressing something that was fully formed internally.
No, like picking up what you're putting down there, I have a similar but lighter experience with just journal writing.
Yeah.
Like when I take my thoughts that are like a cloud or a jumble, and I put them into coherent sentences,
Yeah.
and it's like another dimension of that, or 2 dimensions on top
Yeah.
of that, right?
Yeah.
Where you have to like then put those things adjacent to each other and figure out how they interact.
Right.
And then there's this other level of sharing it with people
Yeah.
and finding out how they think about it, how it should act,
Right.
independent of
Yeah.
mistakes or anything
Yeah.
like that. And that tells you something. That's
Yeah.
like human communication, but different. Right?
Yeah, I mean, this is,
Different.
like, to me, this is really core to why do we do art at all? Like, it's partly about communication with others, but the process of the creation itself is so important to, like, just generating meaningful thoughts. And that's part of why I get really frustrated with some of the, like, okay, actually, no, I'm not going to get into the AI conversation right now. But there's a real value in that. And there are also times when I have set out on a project and been like, I've got this issue or this topic that I really want to explore, so I'm going to write a game about it. I'm going to set up this premise, and then over the course of writing the game, I'm going to figure out how I think about this and how I feel about it, and we're going to get to the ending, and then I will understand, how language and democracy work. Not a made-up example. And sometimes, like, that process leads me to something where I come out the end and I'm like, yes, okay, I now feel like I have a semi-coherent thesis statement about what I think about this. And sometimes, like, what comes out the other end is, like, I have realized that as far as I can tell, this is an unsolvable problem. awesome. But like the process of writing the game has kind of explored that in a way. So Counterfeit Monkey is a language puzzle game that is partly about how reconciling what different people want within a sort of multi-part system can be just ethically hugely problematic. And I never figured out a solution to that, and people write to me and complain that the end of the game is not as happy as they were expecting. And I'm like, well, you know, you solved all the puzzles, you won the game, but like the conclusion I reached is the conclusion I reached, so there you are.
Yeah, and I just keep making game systems for conversation, and I still don't understand conversation.
Well,
so I'm
yeah.
just going to keep doing that until I do.
Right.
Which assumedly will happen at some point, maybe. Okay, so we're a little bit short on time. I'm going to kind of smush together the last two questions, which mostly go together anyways. Do you have any kind of curiosities or hopes for interactive fiction in the future? And they could be like realistic or pie in the sky, like general or personal, anything. We're just going to kind of round out.
Wide open questions. Yeah. I mean, I am unsure how. I mean, honestly, so on the one hand, there is an audience still for things that I loved in the 80s, and an audience for things that I loved in the 2010s, and that's awesome, and I'm really happy about that. It's hard for me to know or guess, like, how many decades more does that last? I don't know. What is the lifespan of these games? Unclear.
Yeah, I have this note which is just, I'm a little morbidly curious about where we are in the arc of time.
Valid.
Yeah, I think this might be a curiosity that you can answer. I'm not actually sure. But like, one other question I got when I was speaking in this other place was somebody asked me about interactive fiction communities of non-English languages. And I was just like, I don't know.
Oh, they
actually.
exist.
Oh,
Yes.
I'm sure they
Yeah.
exist.
Yeah.
I don't know where they are.
Right. Okay. So some of them. Okay. So oh boy. Okay. I don't have time or like the like footnotes handy to fully answer all of that. But there are, like, historically there were French and Spanish and Italian text adventures, and those kind of developed their own strands separate from English language IF for a long time, and there's some cool histories out there available about them. In fact, there's an old PDF of something called the IF Theory Reader from a number of years ago that includes, among other things, some documentation about sort of non-English language IF in it. There's also a Russian language IF community for a while, and then there are also now, or at least within the past 5 or 6 years, have been communities that are doing projects in those different languages, and they sometimes use the same tools as the English language communities, and then in some cases also have their own tooling for it, which is also really interesting and cool, and sometimes have their own competition. So I think Spanish and French are probably the most active that I'm aware of. Italian was pretty active for a while. I don't know if I've heard anything about it recently.
Do you know anything about Chinese communities? Like that
Oh,
was actually
that's
a
a
specific
whole
question
walled.
to me at the time.
Yeah. Okay. So I know that there are things that are a genre that I would recognize as being IF, but I think they have a completely different history and background. And I think there's like the equivalent of Twine-based mobile games, or like, I don't think it's actually Twine, but I think it's sort of like that. Because at some point, some years ago, somebody from that community reached out to me about like, oh, we're translating some stuff to this system. But that's really like the level of knowledge I have about it, and for probably obvious reasons, like it's not as visible here. So yeah.
Yeah, and I guess if I'm going to end my notes, and you can follow up if you want, but just, I guess I have a broad hope that it just keeps going and connects more within and without. Like we talked earlier about like bridging spaces, and I think there's always this argument that like, oh, well, if it doesn't connect to other things, it'll just die out. And that may or may not be true, but I also just think I'd like to see it connect to other spaces for the good of those other spaces and for its own good.
Yeah. No,
And
I
that's
mean,
both in a community sense
Yeah.
and in a design definitional sense, and like that those things can kind of blur the line between kind of games and literature and
yeah.
art and toy and tech and
Yeah.
all of that.
Yeah. No, I share that hope. Cool.
Okay, great. That's us done. We're gonna stop talking to each other, but we do have time for questions if anybody wants.